Post introduction, we enter the book proper. The first chapter is called Samanvay, means synthesis, reconciliation. And the first statement it starts with is very important. It's a very popular statement. Reads Athato Brahma Jignasa. Translated variously. One translation is to say, now that I have curiosity about Brahma, I will take further study in this direction. A mystical translation would be, now that it has begun. Nothing more can be said except that now that it has begun. Because when it begins to a person on the path, often he does not even know the concept of Brahma. But something in him tells him that he is no longer to move on the ordinary path of life, but get into a spiritual search. And even unknown to him, as the words Brahma and Jignasa are, both of them are active in a living sense. So even while he does not know this statement, Athato Brahma Jignasa, it actually is operating in his life. And many scholars who know this statement and 10 interpretations of this statement, it is not active in their life. So the first statement is very important. It is a spiritual statement, not a scholarly statement. And it can happen in a variety of ways to variety of people. All that is certain is that a certain turn has been taken, as Mother puts it. A certain turn has been taken, and the turn is an inward turn. The color and flavor differ from individual to individual, circumstances to circumstances. With this statement, Brahmasutra starts dealing with the difficulties of clash and confusion among different statements of Upanishads, as prevalent in ordinary people and scholars. The pluralism and confusion we are dealing with refers to the different spiritual and philosophical schools within the Hindu fold. Within the Hindu fold, you have one line of the Veda, Upanishad, and the Gita, the classical Sanatan Dharma path. This talks of theism, monoism, spiritual pluralism, rare experiences, enlightenment, karma, moksha, and deeply hidden powers of nature, and deep understanding about all the elements of nature and all the forces of nature. It also talks about how to live and what to do. the two central questions of every human being. So this is one line of the Veda, Upanishad and the Gita. Then we have the Charvaka school, the school of Indian hedonism. Contrary to what many believe, it is not reckless hedonism, it is a profound hedonism. It's an ethical hedonism. It is materialism and hedonism, but of an ethical variety. Then we have the Advaita school, which is very near, almost anchored in Veda, Upanishad and Gita. The school of Shankara. And then flavors of it, Vishisht Advaita and so on. That Brahma alone is real and Prakriti is not an illusion, but it is secondary. The Prakriti is not in evolution as much as the consciousness is. And the path of evolution of consciousness is liberation, not transformation. So the best that can be done in this world is to extricate oneself from this world. You can't change yourself completely, you can't change the world completely. So it is a school of liberation. Whereas Veda, Upanishad and Gita, more so Veda and Gita, they are based upon the school of transformation. They are not pessimistic about the world. They believe the world can be transformed and the world has to be engaged with, and the world is as significant as the consciousness inside. And both of them are connected because it's the same reality both ways, teleologically working in evolution. In Advaita, Prakriti is by and large seen as an obstacle rather than an equal participant in evolution. Then we had the school of Dvaita and many variations of Dvaita. Where God and soul are two different things. Soul and Prakriti are two different things. An eternal dualism, where the source is one, but having divided once, it doesn't go back to unitary oneness. Then we had the school of Buddha, the school of nihilism and nirvana. Which is not very clear about the law of rebirth, but is clear about the law of karma. Atheistic school, all the three, Buddha, Jaina, Sankhya, all the three are atheistic. One reading of Sankhya school can be theistic, but most interpret this to be a atheistic school. All the three, Buddha, Jaina and Sankhya. So the goal in the Buddhist school is nirvana and all cancelling absolute nihil. And in the Jain school is kaivalya, pure consciousness. So pure that even bliss is not felt in its purest form. The Sankhya school of the Purush and Prakriti, the yogic way of physical exercises, breathing exercises, chakras, concentration, dharana, dhyan, leading to liberation, samadhi. The goal state as samadhi. The goal state here is a state of no thought. In Sankhya, the goal state is the Purusha, the observer remains and the Prakriti falls. Again, a state of no thought, differently described, with a distinct experience of the Purusha. In Tantra, it is not only incorporating the goal of liberation, mukti, but it also incorporates the hedonism of Charvaka, the readiness to engage with power and this real world of the Veda, Upanishad and the Gita, as well as the chakra and the kaya system of the yoga. All of that comes together in Tantra, including mysticism and alchemy. So one of very eclectic, open, holistic, integrated schools. In a way, it is a purest form of Veda, as Vimalananda says. But it is more on the lines of Shiva, for whom there are no do's and don'ts. Everything is for exploration and intense living. Of course, this is not for everyone. All these schools differ on these points. The philosophical understanding on the nature of existence. How has it come about? What is its fundamental ontological status? What is the purpose of existence of the universe? What is the goal of life? What state is the goal state of enlightenment? And how to reach to that state of enlightenment? Except for some proponents of Charvaka, everyone would agree that there is a goal state of enlightenment. But the definition would be different and the path would be different. But there would be a difference on how the nature has come to be what it is. So, while there is quite an overlap of spiritual practices, there is a wide difference in philosophy, in goal state and the path to goal state. But when it comes to goal state and path to goal state, there is still a lot of overlap. There is definitely some overlap in the goal state because all the goal states are states of no thought. All the goal states are goal states of freedom from desire and fear and negative effects. All the goal states are goal states that include in some way peace and bliss and freedom and mastery. So there is a huge overlap of spiritual practices, huge overlap, not huge, but substantial overlap on the goal state of enlightenment, substantial overlap of path to enlightenment, but a wide difference in the philosophy of existence. So this is what, and this differences creates differences, and Brahmasutra wants to synthesize all of them or refute some of them if it cannot synthesize. So we start with the chapter of Samanvaya. The Brahmasutra starts with the first topic of Brahma being the ground of existence. So it's a single elemental theory that in the beginning was only one entity, Brahma, and everything comes from there. So it's a single elemental theory. And then from this single elemental one entity, other elementals come about. And these other elementals in turn create this whole world of forms and substances. There is one entity, Brahma, and there is no other. And this is known by intuition or by scriptures, cannot be known by senses. This entity Brahma cannot be known by senses. It can be known by rare experiences, by intuition, or by scriptures. Shruti is scriptures. And therefore, it's a very different kind of knowing process. The ordinary knowing process of science cannot know, cannot lead to Brahman. Problem here is limiting the Brahma because we believe it to be limited. Our idea about an entity and what the entity ought to be, they cannot be the same. There is no certainty that it should be the same. The Kantian principle of the thing in itself applies even more to entities like the first entity Brahma compared to other entities. So the human knowledge is human even if it is transcendental. And there is no way human knowledge can grasp with certainty the whole of reality. We can have our take on it. There can be no certainty about that take we have on reality. And this Brahma can be known by rare experiences of rishis. And this Brahma has a characteristic of creating the chain of creation, sustenance, and dissolution. So the Brahma then does not become the god of creation, rather the god of all the three. So the Brahma talked about here is like the principle of the universe. The principle that in turn leads to creation of three forces: the force of creation, the force of sustenance, and the force of dissolution. And this same principle also creates entities called the truth, the knowability of the truth, knowledge, and infinity. And this entity, Brahma that we call it, exists independent of the subject. So Brahma Sutra here refutes extreme subjective idealism that matter exists only as a condition of the mind. This Brahma, however, is not something that can be seen directly. It is hidden behind the objective reality. The mind The object and everything involved in the process of knowing also is Brahma. And the description of Brahma comes from scriptures, mostly Shrutis, the revealed scriptures, the Vedas and Upanishads, and some Smritis like Gita. An important element here is Brahmasutra says the Purusha is not omniscient or infinitely knowledgeable. It enables knowledge. It's very important. That even when one becomes capable of experiencing a state of no thought, the state of no thought leads to inner freedom but does not lead to power or knowledge. It enables certain forms of knowledge, but it is limited and essential in nature. It does not enable omniscience or a vast amount of comprehensive knowledge. That still has to be developed using the ordinary routes of knowledge development. If we look here psychoanalytically, we are essentially dealing with the philosophy of the mind. We are talking about one immanent thing in nature and mind both, and there being a ceaseless connection between nature and mind. We are not into Immanuel Kant's situation of the subject and the object with nothing connecting them except the process of observation, the process of knowing. We are more into a Hegelian situation where the subject and the object both are connected by an absolute and both are parts of an absolute which is moving towards a teleological goal. Psychoanalytically speaking, it creates a different metapsychological framework. It creates different goal states. It enables thinking about a very different technique of strengthening the Purusha, the observing ego, which in a small way has come in mindfulness. This Purusha can generate spiritual insights, deeply transformative insights. This Purusha strengthening can give us freedom from overwhelming effects of negative effects and desires. And this aspect we have not really leveraged or looked at in psychoanalysis. Can we directly, by strengthening the observing entity within us, not only the observing ego, but the observing Purusha, reduce the overwhelming effect of complexes, negative effects, and desire? If it can be done for a few people, it would be like a wholesale solution. Otherwise, which would take 10 retail transactions to reach the same place. This also brings into focus the element of design in nature, which is something psychoanalysis is terrified of. In fact, entire Western thinking is terrified of it today. The concept of design in existence. Because if there is a design, everything is not in our hands. And there is a purpose, and therefore there are limits to individualism, free will. And we do not have the freedom of impulse. And the hedonistic, individualistic, narcissistic minds want unlimited freedom of impulse. So there is a terror of the concept of design in existence. And the moment we say, in a philosophical sense, Brahma is the ground of existence, Brahma becomes all that is immanent, then the design of existence also comes from Brahma. Then we are not looking at a plain canvas on which we can draw anything. And this design in nature then will put limits on what goals or what techniques will be best suited. Except Jung, we have not seen any important psychoanalytic thinker comfortable with the argument of design in nature. Erikson did talk about program of life, but he stopped short of taking the next step of design in nature and therefore design in human mind. So on point of philosophy, metapsychology, goal states, and strengthening of Purusha for mastery, healing, and development. These are some elements which we can take up for discussion from here into psychoanalysis. Second component that, okay, before that, let me just when Brahmasutra says that it is Brahma which is immanent into everything that exists, it doesn't put it forward as a philosophical premise, as its own axiomatic belief. Rather, it derives the strength for the argument not from its own belief, but from a reference to the scriptures. Especially the Shrutis, the Vedas. And this is a difficult way of proving something. I would have preferred if they start with a given self-belief, seconded by scriptures. But the core strength of that belief comes from one's own belief, rather than a reference to the scripture. Because to derive authority from the scriptures is to deposit omnipotent authority into the scriptures. And those scriptures, when wrongly read, can create trouble because they are endowed then with omnipotent authority. So to have scriptures to second and add to our strength rather than provide validity for what we believe in, is a much safer way in the historical process. Second important point here is Brahmasutra does not go into the conceptualization of God or reality existing transcendental to the universe also. So in Brahmasutra, we essentially see one universe and God being exhausted in one universe as Brahma, that being the philosophical principle. Sri Aurobindo and many others who believe in multiple universes, they put forward another principle, which I personally like, that there is a reality which is not exhausted by creation of universes, and for each universe there is a principle or a Brahma. And even as this reality creates universes, into itself it is not exhausted. So it is something even beyond all universes together, transcendental. So this reality then is transcendental, ground, and immanent, above evolution, also in evolution. The subject and the object of experience. Moving towards a goal, even as a part of it remains above evolution without any goal. So this philosophical model is something that I prefer rather than the philosophical principle of Brahmasutra. Then the Brahmasutra takes up the theme of Sankhya. Sankhya brings about a concept of pradhana, the first cause. And he says that in the first cause, all the gunas exist and consciousness also exists. So there is no pure consciousness from which Prakriti comes. The essence of Prakriti and pure consciousness all existed in the first cause, the original first position state of Pradhan. Brahmasutra replies to this by saying, it cannot happen because in the first cause position then, there would be a stalemate of gunas. And the debate starts from intelligence and consciousness. Sankhya says we don't need to conceptualize a consciousness apart from nature because the sattva guna of nature presupposes intelligence. And so in the first position, when the three gunas exist, the sattva guna also exists and therefore intelligence also exists, which is a manifestation of sattva guna. Brahmasutra takes a contrary position saying there would be a stalemate of gunas in the first position. And therefore there is no way to say that the will of pradhana or the program of pradhana will come from the sattva part of pradhana. And the gunas themselves are manifestations of Brahma. They cannot be the source for all creation. And it uses scriptures to prove scripture. So that's a difficult part about Brahmasutra. After making this argument, it goes to the scriptures, the Vedas, and says, because it is said so there, it is therefore true. One of the difficult parts is to confuse spiritual experiences and philosophy. Essentially, here we are using imagination and ordinary logic to get into a rare state of nature, the state of first creation. And there is no certainty or ground for us to believe that with whatever imagination and logic we have, we can capture the first state with certainty. We can have beliefs, that's fine. But to have certainty is something else. I don't think, given where we are, there is any cause to be certain on this point. So the Brahma Sutra talks then about the primacy of consciousness, and that in Prakriti also there is a consciousness, and there is a nature of Prakriti to overwhelm our consciousness with desires, fears, interactions. The Maya nature of Prakriti, the overwhelming nature of Prakriti. And in the context of this, there is a program of life, a biological program of life, also a psychological program of life. And therefore, in the context of this, there is a purpose of human existence, human history, and also there is a purpose of Prakriti. So, this is the problem that Brahma Sutra wants to solve. And these are some of the ideas which can be used to solve it. Brahma Sutra rather goes to the scriptures to solve it. Cites the authority of scriptures to solve this problem. Another way to solve this is this, that we start with the Vedic concept of primacy of consciousness, consciousness in Prakriti, the Maya nature of Prakriti, the program of life, purpose of human existence in Prakriti, and the philosophical conceptualization of reality as transcendent, ground, and immanent in evolution above evolution, based on laws, free will, chance, and grace. And the Brahma can be experienced as the ground, as the immanent, or both. In Gita, we have this thing of how the Brahma can be experienced. So this set of ideas could have been a much better answer to Pradhana in an axiomatic way, but that would lead to a pluralism, that the concept of Pradhana also would stay and the concept of Vedic idea of only consciousness also would stay. But if you want the idea of Pradhana just to go away, then the question of pluralism does not exist. It's a question of victory and defeat. And then we have to take recourse to the authority of scriptures or authority of somebody. The next theme that the book takes up is the themes of staticity, dynamism, ananda, and all that appears to the human consciousness. These are the themes which are dealt with next. So the Brahma there is explained as the static principle, the ground of all. And here, when some individual merges in its own self, which means he becomes enlightened, the problem arises because if he is merging into something within himself, then how is he merging into Brahma, much of whom is outside? And this is a very geometric, I would say rudimentary way of conceptualizing the inside and outside for Brahma. And this argument is used to say that the pradhana cannot be the self, because in the spiritual journey you are merging into the self, and the self is inside, and the inside definitely is not the pradhana. The problem here is of the use of the word self, the individual self and the global self. Is this falsity of attributing different meanings to the word self that this arises, and in fact does not look like a very strong argument. That when the individual merges into himself, the himself is not pradhana, obviously it is not, but then the self you are referring to is not necessarily the first self. You are either referring to the psychic being, the individual self, the central being, which is still individual self, or the ground. Now, if the ground is believed to be the pradhana unchanged, or some part of pradhana unchanged, then the merger is into the pradhana also. How can you negate it? So the Brahmasutra here falls short in terms of the rigor of logic. Logic in the light of spiritual experiences and the philosophy we are dealing with. Then it goes into the point of the Purusha cannot be the Prakriti. True, but the Prakriti can have its own Purusha, a Proto-Purusha, a Purusha that is not seeking self-awareness, but still Prakriti has its own intelligence and therefore an element of Purusha. Sri Aurobindo's concept of the Jiva, Ishvara and oneness is much more holistic and convincing than when we get lost into where do we merge in the process of enlightenment. The next thematic thing that it takes up is the experience, the spiritual experiences and intuition. Now, this is where the spiritual experience has to be divorced from the intellectual intuition that follows. So, what is experienced is one thing, and post that experience, the intuition about reality, about philosophical problems is quite another thing. That is where leaps and fallacies come in. The next point it takes up is Saguna and Nirguna Brahma. And it says the Brahma can be both Saguna and Nirguna. It is one Brahma which takes up both these aspects. That the entity, the primal entity, can get into existence or non-existence, can have characteristics or not have characteristics, can have qualities or not have qualities. The next question it takes up for reconciliation is the question of Ananda. Can be translated as contentment, rest, peace, freedom, bliss, a combination of all of this. Difficult to translate into English, but a combination of all these entities. And it takes up the question that in some Upanishads, there is a mention of a layer of body, a layer of the integer, human integer called the Anandmaya Kosha. Is that the soul? Is that the Brahma? Because it is that layer which gives us bliss. And bliss is an attribute of Brahma. So is then the Ananda inside or outside, or is the outside inside? This is the question that many Upanishads have talked about, and the Brahma Sutra takes it up. And it resolves it by saying that the Anandmaya Kosh is a part of the individual, and therefore it cannot be the full Brahma. But since Brahma has become everything, it is an immanent expression of Brahma. And the attainer, the attained, and the giver of bliss, all the three is nothing but Brahma. What is repudiated here is the dualism. And reiterated here is the Vedic idea of eminence of one. Then it goes on to say, by the same logic, Prakriti, will, intelligence, bliss, all are manifestations of Brahma. So it repudiates the duality, but still does not endow Prakriti with the same significance as Purusha. The Prakriti is still seen as an unequal player in evolution, more as an obstacle rather than an equal collaborator. And it takes an analogy to say what animates the sun and what animates the eye. And it says that which animates the sun and animates the eye is the same entity, the Brahma. So that which animates the physical universe and that which animates the psychological universe is the same entity. Then it talks about something interesting, and this brings out one of the problems in Brahmasutra. It takes up one statement from an Upanishad which talks about that if you gaze at the sun and if you are spiritually evolved enough, you have practiced yoga enough, you see a person in the sun. And then goes on to describing who the person is. And is the person also a manifestation of Brahma? Now this brings into question human experiences in spiritual practice and converting an individual experience into a philosophy. While you do spiritual practices, you can have 100 experiences. You don't convert them into standardized philosophy. And this is something immature, amateur to do it. But the Brahma Sutra does do it. And this is where one of the points where I think it falls down in profundity. Profoundness. Another statement Brahma Sutra takes up from one of the Upanishads is the concept of Brahma Akash. that there is, when you go inside, you encounter an empty space, and the inner empty space is the inner Akash, the Brahma Akash, which is different from the physical space outside, a psychological sense of an inner space. And that also is Brahma. No proof is given except backing of scriptural authority. Some people have gone to the extent of saying the experience of inner Akash is the experience of enlightenment because it is the experience of emptiness and no thought. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, we see here the confusion of subjective experience and fantasy passing off as truth of reality. We also see a very important concept of bliss, and a part of us where bliss always is. We are not able to access it on a sustainable basis. And this should be a goal of any inner development process, how to get in touch with that bliss as much as possible. Another important element is the epistemological element of intuition. How to understand intuition and to use it to complement everyday common thinking. The book then goes into the next theme of Brahma being pure being with capital B, being with capital B and small being. Heidegger does not go into that ontology, limits himself to descriptive phenomenology. Brahmasutra goes here into the concept of pure being, being and being. It does not get into the concept of pure being, but does get into the concept of being and being. And then starts talking about the third aspect of Brahma, the Rudra part of Brahma, the dissolution. And he says, man is food for Brahma, death a condiment which has been sprinkled over the universe, and everything here dies. So the terrifying form of Brahma, the destructive part of Brahma, dissolving part of that which ends everything. And this creates one of the problems, eternal problems of philosophy, the problem of pain in God's world. It brings about the question of the goodness of Brahma seen from human standpoint. The Brahma Sutra doesn't make any qualitative statement, any evaluative statement on this, just puts it as a descriptive statement with backed by authority of scriptures. And when we say scriptures, we are referring to Vedas and Upanishads, the prior scriptures to Brahma Sutras. The Brahma Sutra then takes up another statement of Upanishad, one of the Upanishads, where it says, the Brahma and individual soul have entered the cave inside of man. Now, this is a statement of spiritual experience put in metaphorical terms. It's not necessarily a literally true statement. Not that there is actually a physical cave inside, but that in the experience, one feels one has gone into a dark space where there is light. And the individual soul and Brahma both are in that cave, and we have to enter from outside after spiritual practices into that cave. And this refers to the experience generally of the psychic being, which is not referred to by Brahmasutras. So it is a difficulty here, because if you don't define the psychic being, and then you say you have entered the cave of the individual soul, then if this is the individual soul, then the question arises whether you can experience only this and not Brahma, only Brahma and not this, both of them you can experience. What is the status of experience chronology? What are the types of experiences we are referring to? That detailing is not there. But it goes on to say the true desire and true purpose of human life is the attainment of Brahma. And Brahma is both beyond pleasure and pain. And there is a play of Brahma and the individual soul. Then deep in the cavity of chest, the individual soul and supreme reside. And the supreme and the individual soul are like light and shade. Supreme is the light, and individual soul is like an emanation from that light. A small light, not necessarily a shade, but I should say a small light. Brahmasutra uses the word shade, but it's more like a small light. It's like the sun and the lamp is a much better analogy than light and shade. And this brings the question of the self. Are we referring to the psychic being, central being, experience of oneness with Brahma? So is self one or two? And this depends upon definitions. We need to use different words to denote different entities instead of using this confusing word self for everything. Otherwise, question will arise, are we talking about one or two self? It's not a right question, because we are talking about different entities that we wrongly club together under the word self. Then the Brahma Sutra takes up one more statement, one more theme from Upanishad, in which it says, it is in prana everything trembles. And this is one of the mistakes where in discussion, not in this statement it is okay, it's fine. The difficulty of this statement is that without the prana, nothing can tremble. And that makes prana a completely different entity than the ordinary understanding of prana, which is the vital force that animates us. Because this prana then becomes a priori to life, and even in the physical universe, either it becomes equivalent to either, in which everything trembles, or a sukshma prana animating the ether, because of which everything trembles. And this creates problems with the word prana, what it exactly means. So on this point, the rigor is not very high. We are not clear whether it's Sukshma prana, equivalent to ether, or prana animating the ether. And then there is a analogy for the Purusha and the Prakriti, that both are hanging from the same tree. One eats the sweet fruit, meaning one experiences, and the other watches the experience. The Purusha sees the experience. The observing ego sees the experience. The participating ego experiences. Philosophically, when we look at the death aspect of Brahma, we are reminded of the death instinct, the universality of the pull to go back to inertia, destruction of self, destruction of the other, inevitable erosion of everything. Brahmasutra first chapter then gets into linking experience of Brahma with experience of beyond deep sleep. That beyond deep sleep, if we go deeper enough, we can experience the Brahma. So one linkage to experiencing the Brahma is to go through deep sleep into a beyond of deep sleep. And those who say prana is Brahma rather than saying prana is one aspect of Brahma are extreme thinkers, the Ativadi. And another way to reach the Brahma is to meditate on Om. And then it takes up the concepts of some Upanishads talk about Parabrahma and Brahmalok. And the concept of Parabrahma is to say that we experience Brahma inside of us. And then there is a Brahma outside of us, that is Para. And Brahmasutra says both are in fact connected to each other and only one. We experience inside of us a small part of what is outside and connected to what is inside of us. And the Brahmaloka is not something separate, but one manifestation of Brahma. Similarly, the small Akasha, the Akasha is outside the sky. The small sky inside, experienced in stillness or in some spiritual states, also is a part of Brahma. Talks about self as a dam wall which has collected emotions, thoughts, matter, everything is collected. Small parts of it is taken from all the zones. And when the doors are opened, everything is dissolved back into the zones from where it came. Now, this small Akasha called Dahara is actually a metaphorical thing, metaphorical expression of an experiential fact. But the expression is metaphorical, it is not exact, so exact to be literally true. And there is no need to take up a metaphorical poetic expression to mean something concrete, spatial, something literal, and then start analytically going into the literal meaning and the rigor of it. Again, something immature. It should not have been taken up at all. Not in this way, at least. Takes up the question then of one of the Upanishads says, the light of the sun, is it the light of Brahma? In an essential sense, yes. If by that we mean the purest of the pure light, Brahmasutra then says, yes, it is the same thing. The light of sun is also Brahma. Same thing manifest in sun, same thing manifesting as the light of sun. And then it takes up a strange question. Can the devas or the celestial beings work for their own evolution by studying Vedas? And it raises a strange question. Whom will they pray to? If human beings pray to sun, and sun wants to pray, who will he pray to? He cannot pray to himself. Obviously, he can pray to Brahma, the source from where he has come. Or he can pray to other celestial beings. And therefore, they also can study Vedas. And where they are to be prayed, they can leave that part and pray to others and pray to Brahma. Again, an immature discussion. Brahmasutra then comes to the idea of Platonic forms. And it says, before the jar comes into existence, there is the word jar, and the potter makes jar out of the word jar. So there is a Platonic idea before nature activates that Platonic idea into a real entity. And then it quotes the scriptural authority of the Veda to say, the world comes from the word of Veda. So the word is the source, and it's not temporarily converted into existence. Because in one of the Upanishads, the argument is that words are temporal, but existence is not temporal. So Brahmasutra says the word that is referred to in Veda is not a temporal word. It goes on to say that there are two kinds of ends to universe. The Pralay and Mahapralay. Pralay means the laws of the universe remain the same. The laws come together in such a way that the universe is destroyed and recreated. But the fundamental laws still remain the same. So the word remains the same. The first word, the root of all laws, the word of the Veda, that remains the same. Mahapralay is that where even the word, even the first law, the law of laws is destroyed. And after some time, the whole creation is created anew, and a new Veda is given, a new word is given. The Brahma Sutra then talks about the sphota and the word and says sphota is explosion, a minor explosion inside of the consciousness. And we talked about the five bodies. So every event actually is a spot, an explosion, an event with a event like a minor explosion inside the system. And in each of the body, there are remnants of every event. The Brahma Sutra then gets into worship and evolution. Talks about worship, not so much about evolution. And then comes the passage, a very objectionable passage, which I think has been inserted later by motivated individuals, cannot be the part of the original Brahma Sutra. Talks about rights of certain groups of individuals. Do they have a right to study the Veda? And it starts to take scriptural authority to say certain groups of people may not have the right, which is completely absurd, completely against the entire Hindu spirituality. So this is seems to be a letter contamination, has to be removed. Then it goes into the idea of avyakta and the idea of knowability and puts up a question: is the pradhan knowable? Is the first position of the universe knowable? Is the avyakt knowable? And it says it is knowable because the avyakt also is a part of Brahma. And the Brahma is knowable, not in an ordinary sense of knowing, but it can be realized in experience. And then it goes into criticism of Sankhya's model of 25 elementals. Sankhya's model of 25 elementals does not go on lines of Brahma Sutra. It criticizes that and generally uses scriptural authority of Vedas to criticize it. I would have preferred to criticize it on philosophical grounds, grounds of spiritual experience. And then it defines existence and non-existence. The first cause as existence as Sat, non-existence as Asat, both flowing out of Brahman. And then it says from the self comes the pranas and from pranas comes the world. And the word prana then takes a very different meaning here. It becomes the elemental of movement instead of elemental of life. That's a very different meaning of the word prana. Which again creates problems. It's better to coin new words than to stretch and confuse existing words. A good statement there is, rising out of this element, he vanishes again after them. When he has departed, there is no more knowledge. This statement is something that I really like from Brahmasutras. For once it raises to the heights that one wants Brahmasutra always to be at. Statement means from elementals arises the consciousness, the individual. From Prakriti, the individual arises, but he gets crazy going after Prakriti. So from Prakriti, consciousness arises and the consciousness then goes crazy going after Prakriti. When he has departed, there is no more knowledge. This can be interpreted in two ways. One is when the ordinary consciousness has departed and one has become pure Purusha, there is no more need for knowledge. There is no more knowledge. One is only having an observation, a pure consciousness. Second is when one goes into a state where that part of Brahma of which knowledge can be had, that part completely goes away. There is no more recognition of Prakriti. One is only pure consciousness. There is no more knowledge because there is no more object of knowledge. The third interpretation can be when the ordinary state has departed, he has departed, and one is merged into Brahma. There is merger, but no more knowledge of ordinary type. So knowledge by identity, but no more knowledge of identity of the ordinary type. You can also interpret no more knowledge as no more desire for knowledge. So we see here in the first part trying to reconcile Upanishads, trying to rectify the faults, trying to establish harmony. There are a few central arguments. Argument of all is Brahma, argument of scriptural authority being supreme, and the process of refutation being based on scriptural authority. At times, taking up something which is a spiritual experience, metaphorically expressed as though a literal expression, which ought to be rigorously philosophically accepted or rejected. It's needlessly converting poetry into prose and treating this as prose. There is also a philosophical problem of, not a problem, but a philosophical position where there is no transcendent entity. The only entity is the entity spread out in the universe, the ground of universe, the Brahma. So it's a one elemental model. And then there is the problem of significance of Prakriti, either as an equal collaborator or more likely as an obstacle. So, and also lastly, the problem of various states of enlightenment not dealt with, because they are what are causing so much of problem, confusion among the Upanishads. So, the attempt at synthesis, clarification, reconciliation, it's a noble attempt, a good attempt, but I would not say at the highest levels. I find a combination of Sri Aurobindo Tantra and a pluralism of enlightenment goal states, that combination is a far better ideational and experiential philosophy and structure to harmonize all Hindu scriptures, including the Upanishads, then the Brahmasutras. We go to the second chapter, and as we go deeper, we will see if Brahma Sutra takes a different height, a different depth, and we change our opinion. Whatever we believe in, there is no doubt that it's an extraordinary work. May not be at the highest, but far above any ordinary scripture. Taking upon a task so difficult, few would dare to do, even fewer would accomplish. So, a noble task, great work, but I would have liked it to anchor itself at something higher than where it has anchored. Thank you.